Sure. I mean, President Trump has the admirable goal of putting a stop to the deaths of civilians, the deaths of soldiers on both sides. He doesn't like killing, and he's made that very, very clear. He wants to put a stop to that. But there's a paradox here, which is the fact that there'll be no ceasefire, for example. The ceasefire idea seems to have gone out of the window. A ceasefire would have put a stop to the fighting and then paved the way to a peace deal. And now the fighting will continue. A peace deal will take as long as it takes. And more killing will happen, more people will die on both sides. So don't you think that ceasefire step should not have been overlooked?
Well, look, we've seen President Putin break ceasefires before. And I think where the Trump administration is at on this is, look, if you can get to an actual peace deal, that could be more concrete than a ceasefire. We've seen ceasefires break, but peace deals can often last. And the goal, though, in the end, is to get to a macro end of this war, a sustained, permanent end of this war. And whether you do that in a ceasefire or a peace deal, the bigger dynamics are certainly stopping the killing, stopping the violence, getting that to end. And this peace deal could be a step towards doing that, not just in the short term, but the long term. But the bigger elements of this is recognizing this will take time. Whether you have a ceasefire or a peace deal, the true end of this war, I think, will take time to get done. I think we have a lot of work ahead of us here, as the United States does, and President Trump does, and Europe and President Zelensky have a lot of work ahead in terms of getting this war to come to an end. But ultimately, it comes down to getting to that negotiating table. And I think one of the biggest things you got out of this over the past couple of days in terms of these meetings was getting President Putin to agree to meet with President Zelensky. So let's see what happens with that bilateral meeting. The bigger elements of that are getting to what needs to be done to get the war to come to a permanent end. That's going to be covering security guarantees, certainly land, and then what role does Europe play in that, and what role does the United States play in all of that? I think President Trump is making tremendous progress on getting what you need in the short term here, and that is getting President Zelensky, President Putin to the negotiating table, and then from there figuring out what can be done to get this to be not just a short-term ceasefire, but to get to be a long-term permanent end of the war.